Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you.
Welcome back, wildlings. Old times, old crimes. If it comes down to it, you'll find that everyone has parts of their past that they will want no one else to hear about. So what do you do if your friends want to take you back to the place where, well, all of them happened? Any way you mix it, it's gonna come out ugly. As in tonight's aberrant apocalypse, The Brimstone Conspiracy. Written by Stephen D. Harris.
Through me, you go into a city of weeping. Through me, you go into eternal pain. Through me, do you go amongst the lost people. Dante's Inferno. Okay, you're not driving if you keep that shit up. Mark snatched the keys from Scott's hand, who couldn't even bother to protest while shotgunning down his second 20-ounce can of beer. He belched loudly, wiping foam from his lips with the sleeve of his black trench coat. Yeah, why do you think I'm doing this? It's been your turn to drive for at least 30 miles now, he said, washing down the malt liquor with a sip from his flask as an extra assurance that he was well past the legal limit. Now, if you don't mind, I'm gonna stock up on cheap vodka and Pop-Tarts. Be back in a minute. From the gas pump, Josh checked his phone for the time. Make it quick, Scott. I want to get to Asheville before noon. The fourth member of the group, Chloe, was tuned out of the conversation by her headphones. To her, this trip was about padding her portfolio with black and white photographs of crumbling buildings. The sort of thing that would make her look well-rounded without requiring any real effort. They all had their reasoning for traveling to Asheville, Kentucky. Mark wanted to have a kind of fun, kind of spooky adventure and maybe get a little closer with Chloe. Josh wanted to show people how coal mining destroys homes, ecosystems, and natural beauty. And Scott, well, he wanted to check up on his childhood home. And drink. Heavily. Of course. Together, they were legend tripping, an age-old practice of visiting the strange locations of urban myths, places such as the Baird Chair Monument, the Screaming Beaches, or the Spider Gates Cemetery. Popular sites frequently visited by tour groups or rowdy teenagers, locations with a history of the tragic, the horrific, or just plain old supernatural acclaim. Anyone with an authentic sense of skepticism who's visited these places knows that a haunting is really nothing more than psychological priming. Stories that are just that, scary words that mean nothing but still manage to trick the lizard brain into pricking up the neck hairs. And for the most part, this was the working assumption of Asheville. The only discernible difference was the scale, Asheville being an entire town rather than a bridge or a farmhouse. "Oh, let's go," Scott shouted as he tossed his alcohol into the back seat of his 2003 Saturn POS. Josh hung the nozzle on the gas pump and Mark turned the ignition. Then they were off into the hills. Approximately 9 minutes later, Mark had a thought. "You didn't pay for those, did you?" he asked Scott, now irritated with his increasingly erratic behavior. "Of course not, idiot," he replied, beginning to open his toast or pastry with his teeth. "You guys didn't want to cover an even split of the gas. Now, I gotta steal stuff. Really, it's more your fault than mine." Scott took a bite of the crumbling, frosted deliciousness without concern. "You're a goddamn asshole. You know that, right?" Scott just chuckled to himself. At this point in the journey, there wasn't anything any of them could realistically do to get back at him. It was Scott's car, and he was the only one of the four who knew how to get into Asheville. In the 15 years since it was abandoned, no new road maps had any listing of the town. The GPS wouldn't register the place, and the two bridges that led into the town had been demolished and marked up with roadblocks just in case someone ended up going in the wrong direction.
Plus, the county sheriff patrol was under orders to arrest anyone trespassing within the city limits. Scott knew how to get around these barriers, having lived in the town until the age of 10, committing large portions of the geography to his long-term memory. After a few minutes of silence, Josh decided to start working on his environmental project, asking Scott to talk about what he remembered about his family's forced removal from their property. He held up a digital recorder close to Scott. It was October 2nd, 1999, approximately 8:13 a.m. on a Thursday night when the National Guard banged on our front door. There was overcast, slight rain, temperature 74 degrees. The school had been closed the previous day to its close proximity to the fires. Scott narrated as coherently as he could. It helped that his memory was better than most, even while drunk. It didn't hurt, either, that he had practiced his speech earlier with Josh at the motel. They told us that the sulfur that had been ignited by the anthracite was oxidizing in the clouds to produce sulfurous and sulfuric acid rain. The governor had declared eminent domain over everyone's properties while the EPA tried to clean up the mess. We were given 24 hours to vacate before the rising carbon monoxide levels reached lethal concentration, but they suggested we leave as soon as possible. My dad threw a fit, swearing at the soldiers about a conspiracy to steal his land and mineral rights. They tried to assure him that he would be compensated and given a new home in Frankfurt. He and Mom had been fighting all night about leaving. She wanted to go, he wanted to stay, but there was no convincing him. He'd always been a delusional man, always ranting about chemtrails, black helicopters, the Illuminati, and whatever else managed to catch his attention. I doubt he ever met a conspiracy he didn't like, but he never acted as irrational as he did that day. I think he just snapped when he saw all those Jeeps pull into his driveway. I mean, it wasn't even close to being debatable that there was a legitimate emergency. Just the day before, coal vein caught fire beneath Chuck's gas and go. We all heard the explosion, we saw the smoke, but he wouldn't listen. My mom left right then and there, threw me and our luggage into one of the guardsmen's armored jeeps, and the last I saw of my dad was him loading a shotgun on the porch, face red and sweaty with rage as the soldiers just shrugged and left him there. Scott paused, cracking open another beer and lighting a cigarette before continuing. On our way out of town, I got a first-hand look at the chaos. Somebody's house had been partially collapsed into a flaming sinkhole. I saw families throwing trash bags full of clothes into their cars, police and National Guard directing traffic towards the southern bridge out of town, while hazard trucks and ambulance rushed the other direction. Smoke rose in thick black streaks into the gray sky. Emergency sirens blared, loud enough to almost mask the sounds of scarce gunfire. Apparently, my dad wasn't the only paranoid libertarian in Chesterton. Oh yeah, this was all, of course, before the town got its nickname. Before Asheville, it was just Chesterton. Can probably guess why it changed. What do you think happened to your father? Josh asked, already knowing the answer, but wanting to get something recorded. He's dead, replied Scott without any hesitation. The next half hour was mostly quiet, aside from the stereo, until at last Scott spoke up with the directions to get off the interstate onto a smaller highway, and then again onto a county road. From there it was a straight shot, until they crossed the Leviza Fork, and from there it was east until they were on the western side of the Blue Ridge Forest. Damn, this forest is beautiful, said Mark, commenting on the temperate, deciduous topography. Yeah, it's a real land of mirth and merriment, said Scott sarcastically. See that dirt trail coming up ahead to the right? Turn there and follow it up the mountain. When you see the cabin, just park somewhere. After 15 minutes of a zigzag descent, they reached a moss-covered cabin in the middle of the woods. Everyone exited the vehicle, stretching their backs and taking a look around. What is this place?
asked Chloe, speaking up for the first time that day. "It's my dad's old hunting shack. He took me up here a few times." Scott threw an empty beer can at the cabin, startling a bobcat that had been sleeping under the porch. "We could probably camp out here if we spend too much time hiking to and from Asheville. If we try to leave after dark, cops might see our headlights and then they'll give us shit," he continued. Chloe took a picture of the cabin. "Well, how far is it to Asheville?" asked Josh, not very pleased at the idea of having to spend the night at such a place. "This is literally as close as we can get to it by driving. It's about a 14-mile hike down the other side of the mountain hill thing, so we should probably start, like, right now. Actually, wait a minute." Scott walked toward the cabin, kicking in the door with a hard stomp of his boot. While he was rummaging around in the hunting shack, Chloe changed into her hiking boots while Mark and Josh unloaded the rest of their gear from the trunk. The items they needed, of course, were canteens, a compass, pair of binoculars, Josh's digital camera, and the rest of Chloe's stuff. Also included were 4 sets of full-faced air-purifying respirators with clear eyepieces that reduced the restriction to peripheral vision. Once they reached Asheville proper, it would likely be necessary to protect their lungs from soot and other lingering contaminants. Scott returned from the cabin with a large hunting rifle slung across one shoulder. "For bobcats," he said before anyone could question him. "Also, feral dogs if we run into any. Not everyone managed to evacuate their pets, so, right, follow me." Scott stumbled himself into some bushes, having trouble using his legs after consuming such ridiculous quantities of booze. The others looked at each other with uncertain grimaces. It wasn't much of a secret that Scott was an alcoholic, but until now he had refrained from becoming completely intoxicated before noon. Mark wanted to say something, but Josh shot down the idea before anything could be spoken. He didn't think it was a good idea to piss off the only guide they had, especially when said guide was carrying a loaded gun. And drunk. So they marched on, following Scott across the small mountain. Besides the random yelling of Scott, the path was quiet, peaceful for the first leg of the journey. Chloe got some decent snaps of trees being trees, as did Josh in his attempt to show the slow decaying health of the local flora as they approached the ash cloud that hung permanently over the town. After perhaps 2 hours of walking, the 4 managed to find a rock that ejected itself horizontally from the now descending mountainside, granting their first clear view of the valley below. A red haze hung flat, almost like a lake, maybe half a mile down the slope. Peeking from the top of this cloud was the upper portion of a water tower and the tip of a church steeple. Beside that, a few lines of smoke snaked from the sea of red. Everything else laid beneath that thick smog. From this vantage, it was possible to see the transition of trees going from perfectly fine to sickly and finally dead husks of skeletal wood. Josh and Chloe both captured images of the vista while Mark sniffed the air. "Smells like fireworks and rotten eggs," he said with an unpleasant look on his face. Scott lit another cigarette for himself. "The shape of the valley makes its own weather. Most of those heavier fumes just stay in the one place while the rest hang around until a breeze from between the hills manages to carry away the excess. Some of it, of course, wafts all the way up here, hence the smell of the sulfur and the coal. By the way, that fire burning beneath the town, it's got enough fuel to keep going for another 300 years, so that cloud isn't going anywhere for a while." Scott stated all of these facts nonchalantly, hopping down from the angular rock and proceeding with the path ahead. The others followed, partially excited, partially nervous. After 50 or so meters of walking, the air began to smell foul enough that the group thought it best to put on the masks. It was at this point that the trees looked diseased enough to warrant the precaution. Scott had rigged his mask with a small one-way hose that led from a funnel directly to his mouth. He tested his contraption with a long pour from a bottle of vodka. "I'm thirsty," he yelled just before the descent into the cloud.
Well, you shouldn't be so goddamn drunk this early in the day, Mark yelled back to him through his respirator. Chloe rolled her eyes and poured some water into Scott's funnel. Thank you, sweet pea, said Scott in gratitude. Now everyone listen the fuck up. We're gonna go down into that cloud. You guys are gonna take some fancy done pictures, and I'm gonna throw up in my old house. Then we leave and shit. Got it? The group nodded in agreement. Okay, let's do it. And the four walked into the cloud. The first thing that they noticed was the road. They had managed to reach Main Street, and the side of the road set an example for the state of the rest of the town. A deep, winding fissure ran the length of the road with what looked to be steam rising periodically from the crack. Josh recorded everything he saw. Scott pulled out a single match. Watch this, he said, tossing it to the pavement. A few seconds later, the head burst into flames. Ground here is hot enough to ignite match heads. Careful standing there. A few more minutes and those boots of yours are going to be little puddles of melted rubber. Yeah, let's not do that, said Mark, moving to the sidewalk. He touched the concrete and found it cool enough to stand on safely. Looking up, he saw the sign. Warning, it read. Ground may suddenly collapse. What the hell? How dangerous is this place really? He asked in an angered tone. Josh and Scott both laughed. Dude, did you seriously do no research on this place? What the hell did you think we were wearing gas masks and trying to avoid the police for? Of course it's dangerous, said Josh, filming Mark's reaction to the sign. Come on. Scott said that the first sinkhole appeared near the cemetery. Let's check that out first. The four walked side by side down the main road into Asheville. They passed cars with melted tires and burnt frames, and piles of ash that collected like snow along the road. One car in particular had an odd symbol scratched into the passenger door. It was a double cross with a figure 8 at the base. Brimstone, said Scott, eyeing the etching suspiciously. As sulfur was once called by alchemists. Later, it was adopted as the satanic cross by that guy from the 60s. Here, check it out. Scott rolled the sleeve of his trench coat to show his tattoo of the same symbol on his forearm. Why the hell do you have that? Asked Mark. Being the only religious member of the group, he was somewhat alarmed at the sight. He also thought that it was weird that he'd known Scott for 3 years without, until now, seeing his tattoo. Scott didn't answer, though. Kept walking. They walked past a playground where the paint from the recreational structures had been stripped by the acid, and metal beneath partially warped into disfigured hunks of steel. Chloe, of course, had to get a picture of a clown's head that had been almost melted into an unrecognizable borderline demonic state. Eventually, they found themselves walking through the downtown portion, where taller buildings stood parallel to one another. Some collapsed under their own weight, others managed to stay upright after all these years, but in both cases, the red-orange haze gave the structures an appearance of being ghostly monoliths instead of pie shops and dollar stores. The first sense of creepiness began to set in with the understanding of how truly abandoned the town was. Mark looked around at some of the dark rectangles that used to be windows. Anyone else get the feeling they're being watched? He asked sincerely. Boo! Yelled the other three in unison. Don't try and ruin this for us, Mark, shouted Chloe. Yeah, fuck you, douchebag, yelled Scott. He followed his insult by throwing a rock at Mark's head. It bounced from his skull with an audible clunk. Looking up after sheltering his face, Mark saw Scott and Chloe share a high five. Anger started to swell within him, and the next thing he knew, he was throwing a swift punch into Scott's gut. A second later, Mark was on the ground, having been rammed in the ribcage by the butt of Scott's rifle. Knock it off, both of you, shouted Josh, forcing himself between the two. You've been getting on each other's nerves since the first thing in the goddamn morning. Scott, quit being a dick. You could have broken his mask, and that shit ain't funny. And Mark, get your shit together.
Mark was just about to say something when a faraway noise stopped him. Everyone was silent for a moment, listening intently to what sounded like a vicious animal attacking a smaller one. Snarling, screeching sounds not unlike a dog shaking a rabbit between its clenched jaws. The sounds echoed along the length of the abandoned street between buildings, amplifying into an ominous frequency. And then, as fast as it appeared, it was gone. All four stood motionless and quiet until the sounds faded into the dead weather. "Okay, that was actually kind of spooky," said Chloe, being the first to speak up. "I told you there might be a few dogs scampering about," responded Scott, loading a shell into the rifle's chamber. "Yeah, but how could anything be even alive in this place?" asked Josh. Scott pointed to a patch of weeds sprouting from a crack in the pavement. "Life finds a way. Come on, let's cut through this alley. My old neighborhood should be just on the other side." The other three followed him. Houses with broken windows and collapsing roofs littered the former residences. Paint streaked down the outer walls from years of corrosion. Chloe stopped for a couple shots while Josh filmed video of a sinkhole with small flames rising from the inner edges. A sinkhole that was once someone's front yard. Ash fell like snowflakes onto his camera. Suddenly, Scott started shouting and dancing a drunken dance. "Look! There it is! 156 Peachtree Lane." Scott pointed at a particularly aged house with a rusting pickup truck in the warped driveway. He took another victory shot through his mask. "After all these years, that piece of shit still stands. I can't believe it." "You want to look inside?" Chloe asked, starting to match Scott's energy. Mark made an expression of concern under his gas mask. "That thing looks about ready to collapse. You really want to add extra weight to those floorboards?" Mark didn't want to look like a coward again in front of Chloe, but he couldn't help but be the rational one. While Scott was charismatic, reckless, and amoral, Mark was the opposite in practically all ways. "I'll tell you what, Mark," said Scott in a condescending tone. "Why don't you wait out here and be the lookout for the ghouls and the goblins?" He laughed, tossing the rifle to Mark. "I'll just be a minute." With that, Josh, Chloe, and Scott entered the house, leaving Mark to stand alone on the weeded lawn. Josh held his flashlight at shoulder level, scanning the interior of the living room from left to right. Surprisingly little of the smog had managed to make its way into the house, and for the most part, the air was pretty clear. Scott took the chance to lift his mask for a cigarette. "Ugh, gross. It's like sucking on a sack of burnt hair," he said, tasting the air. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply. "Ugh, that's better. So, what do you guys think?" Chloe took a picture of Scott's former living room with a flash, angling it to capture as much of it as possible. "I'd say I'll be getting my BA this year for sure," she said, taking another of a cracked television. The three scattered about the house, checking every room they found. From the looks of it, it appeared as though Scott's father had continued to rampage for a while after the evacuation, judging by the holes punched into the plaster and flipped over furniture. The master bedroom was in a state of rather severe trauma. Scott took a sip from his flask, handing it to Chloe and Josh, each partaking, and after a few more minutes of rummaging through the closets, drawers, and whatnot, Chloe found a family photo. A pleasant-looking woman, a 10-year-old Scott with that same angry look on his face, and a tall, barrel-chested man with a thick beard. Chloe handed the framed picture to Josh before Scott noticed what they were looking at. "Damn, dude," called Josh to Scott. "Your dad looks like a lumberjack." Scott walked across the bedroom to inspect the picture. He slipped it from the glass that had protected it for all these years. "I wonder what happened to him," he continued as Scott folded the photo into his jacket. "Like I said before, he died," replied Scott. "Probably somewhere in this very house. It's not like he drove anywhere. Pickup's still in the driveway."
Josh and Chloe looked at each other with the same idea in their minds. Want to find the body? They both asked, knowing the one place in the house that they hadn't searched. Absolutely, said Scott, swallowing another shot from his flask before resealing his mask. Basement's this way. Outside, Mark paced back and forth across the lawn in anger. His experience for this trip was basically the exact opposite of what he had hoped for. Scott was probably going to fuck Chloe in the motel on the way back home, while Josh, his best friend, was more concerned with his stupid project than with defending him. On top of all this, he was left outside in the creepy haze of a condemned town that sat on top of a burning chasm. He made up his mind when the others were done screwing around in the house that he was leaving. He would walk back to the car all by himself if he had to, but he wasn't going to spend another minute in this hellhole. He leaned against the back bumper of the paint-stripped pickup, letting out a sigh that briefly fogged his eye plate. As he leaned there, just staring off into the middle distance, something across the street caught his attention. A light wind had blown into the valley, just enough to make vaguely clear objects at 30 feet or less. In this case, it was the house across the street. The sound, like someone dropping a metal hammer onto hollow wood, resonated from the building within. Mark looked up from his thoughts, and a second later tightened his grip around the rifle. The breeze that had rolled in a moment previously had caused the drapes of the house's front smashed windows to softly move, revealing some of what hid behind them. Following the origins of the noise, what he saw, if only for a split second, was a pale figure standing in the window frame, blurred by the returning haze, and staring a straight line right towards where Mark stood. He blinked and it was gone. The fuck? He said to himself, now incredibly tense with a lingering fear of what he had just witnessed. He looked around his immediate surroundings, unsure of what to do, and so backing slowly towards Scott's house. Another beat passed when he heard the growling, a vicious growl that echoed through the fog. Guys, he yelled as loud as he could through his mask, and broke into a run. What's with the scratches? Did you guys have a dog or something? Chloe asked while looking at the door to the basement. Large chunks of paint and wood seemed to have been violently ripped out of it. No, Scott said, trying the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. Taking a step back, he proceeded to break open the door with a forceful kick. Part of the frame splintered as the 3 separate deadbolts tore through the wood. Light, please. Josh illuminated the darkness with his flashlight, showing the descending steps. The staircase creaked with each step, but still it held the weight of all 3 as they continued downwards. At the base, plastic tarps hung from the ceiling, sectioning off the staircase from the rest of the basement. Scott cut a slit in it with his pocket knife and noticed that the dry heat was wafting in. The lower we go, the closer we are to the underground fires. Watch your shoes here. The 3 wandered into the basement proper, and Chloe and Josh lit the place with the new addition of Scott's lantern. The ground was indeed warm to the touch, but not as much as they expected. Looking around, it was a normal basement with stores of expired canned food, cardboard boxes filled with Christmas ornaments, and a couple of gun cabinets. The first thing to be genuinely noticed, however, was the fissure that ran across the bare concrete floor up the length of the western wall. The other was a skeleton wrapped in dried hair and tissue propped up in the corner. "Oh shit!" cried Josh, almost dropping his flashlight. Scott patted him on the shoulder. "Yeah, there's Dad. Stupid bastard just wouldn't let go." Scott walked up to the carcass, inspecting it from every angle. A shotgun was held between its arms, slumped casually to one side. Scott then noticed the spent shell on the floor to one side, and traced the angle of the hole in its skull to the dark stain on the wall behind it. Or maybe he did. Scott shrugged to himself, before attempting to pry the gun from its dead hands. Josh raised his flashlight to the right side of the remains, noticing the alchemical symbol for Brimstone drawn into the wall with motor oil. Beneath it, words were written. "Demons are everywhere," it spelled out. Scott, what the hell?" Josh asked. At this point, he was justifiably disturbed, having witnessed both the dried, leathery remains of a human corpse and a cryptic message alluding to something clearly sinister. Scott walked over to the sigil. He looked at it almost without any concern whatsoever, being far more preoccupied with picking the fingers from the shotgun's hilt. Yeah, that's weird or whatever. You guys want to grab anything? It's not looting if it's technically my stuff. How the hell are you this calm? Even Chloe was getting nervous, more so by Scott's drunken attitude than anything else. Scott was about to say something when a muffled yell managed to penetrate through the basement. All three heard it. Well, I guess Mark wants us to finish up, Scott said while looking back towards the stairs. Come on, he's been out there alone long enough. A sense of true fear arose after the three made their way back into the haze. Mark was nowhere to be found. Josh slid his mask up just enough to get out a few good calls, but nothing was heard in reply. Oh, god damn it, Josh growled. That dickhole still has my keys. If he pussied out and ran back to the car, I swear I'm gonna murder him. Scott proceeded to curse to himself incoherently while Chloe and Josh tried their best to figure out what to do next. He probably just got spooked or something and left without saying anything. He's passive-aggressive like that. I don't think he wanted to confront anyone, Chloe rationalized. True, but he doesn't know this place at all. He's dumb, but he's not that dumb to wander around all by himself. Josh grew more apprehensive by the second. Scott kicked the side of the rusting pickup hard enough to knock off the passenger door, just as more animal noises were heard in the distance. Okay, fine, he yelled at no one in particular. The creepy noises scared Mark, and he ran like a bitch back to the shack without telling us. That's about a 3-hour walk, so if we hurry, then we should be able to catch up with him just in time to kick his ass good and proper. Good plan? Great fucking plan. Scott took an exceptionally long drink from his flask, running it dry in the process. Okay, let's go. Chloe and Josh just followed him into the carmine mist. There, just keep it like that, Josh said as he tied part of the torn dress into a proper sling. He was shaking but still managed to make the knot tight. Chloe thanked him with her eyes but was still having trouble finding her words. Scott peeked through the drapes of the wedding boutique, scanning what little he could of the street outside. That was the scariest fucking thing I've ever seen in my goddamn life. He spoke quietly, backing away from the window slowly. He poured some water into his funnel, feeling the dehydrating effects of alcohol, yet not expressing any desire to become sober anytime soon. He rolled one of his unopened vodka bottles over to Josh and Chloe, who were hiding behind the cashier's counter. The three of them would have moved further back into the building, except that the posterior half of the storage room had fallen into a fissure, with the rest of it being too hot to dwell in for very long. Even here in the showroom, some of the mannequins were partially melted stick figures in their bridesmaid dresses, faces deformed, arms raised at the wrong angles. Josh splashed some vodka onto his leg where the cut had been made, tying some frilly thing around his thigh to help with the bleeding. Chloe took a drink with her good hand. They had run into this shop just after the attack, giving the thing the slip as they turned a few corners. Scott was the only one left uninjured, but then again, he was the only one who fought back. Of course, in the chaos of the moment, it didn't work out as well as he'd intended. Look, I'm sorry I broke your arm, Scott apologized for the missed kick. Well, it's better than blowing off my head, Chloe replied. No one was really mad at each other, not anymore. It was probably their bickering that had lured the thing to them in the first place. A rotting, putrid thing. A wadded mass of skin and flies that lurked in the crimson haze, waiting and stalking and angry. Listen, Scott began to think clearly in the situation. We have about 3 hours left before our filters will need to be changed. Round about that time, the sun will be setting, right behind the mountains. If that happens while we're still under the cloud, we won't be getting out of it. The other two nodded in agreement. What was also left out was the fact that any wet, exposed skin was beginning to inflame and sting from the myriad pollutants. Scott loaded a few more shells into his gun. Josh checked that his camcorder still worked, and Chloe slung her backpack across her back. "Ready?" he asked rhetorically, standing off to the side of the front door. Once again, the others nodded. Scott threw the door open, and they burst into a sprint. Mark climbed the hill as fast as he could. His legs were weak, barely able to hold him upright against the slope, but he pushed on, knowing that if he stopped, or he rested too long, whatever it was that was following him would catch up. He couldn't see it, but he could hear it, maybe 20 meters back, maybe closer. He'd been running for so long that he'd hardly any time to address the guilt of abandoning his friend. Perspiration and tears mixed on their path down his face. Prayers were muttered under the effort of his breath. At last, after hours of panicked scampering, hiding, yells of terror, and running for his life, Mark had made his way to the other side of the mountain. It would only be a short descent until he would reach the car, and a few minutes later he could even see it, except that something caused Mark to hesitate, the sight of 2 county police cars waiting patiently next to the Saturn. It took a moment to collect himself, brought on by the continued noise of snapping twigs and footsteps coming over the peak, reminding him that the police were the best possible people to run into right now. He threw the hunting rifle and mask to the ground and found enough inner strength to sprint the rest of the way to the hunting shack. "Hey!" he yelled, waving his hands as he stumbled closer to the officers. Both looked up to see him, motioning quickly for him to approach. "Is this your car?" one of them asked in an authoritative tone. No, it's my friend's," he responded, trying to catch his breath. "There are others with you?" "How many? Where are they?" asked the second. Mark looked over his shoulder, checking to see if he was still being followed, while letting the officers implicitly know where the others were. "Did you know that you've been trespassing on federal property? You think this is some kind of a joke?" Mark paused briefly. No, it's not a joke. Just listen, Mark tried to explain, but he was interrupted. "On your knees, now," barked the officer. "Hands behind your head." Mark complied, still sure that this was better than the alternative, still hoping that someone would send help for the other 3 still back in Asheville. He was sure that was, until both officers raised their sidearms. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is out here?" said the first. Scott watched the specks of blood exit the back of Mark's head through the scope of the hunting rifle. A half-second later, the sound of the shots reached his ears. He was on his stomach, using the ground to steady his aim. His lip curled in anger, almost reaching his nostrils. He centered one officer's face under the sights. 1 round fired, then another chambered, then a second fired. Both bodies fell like rag dolls. He waited a beat just to be sure that there weren't any others, and then stood up, walking quickly the rest of the way to the hunting shack. Chloe had been the first to go, some flaming thing leaping through the cloud and tackling her into a sinkhole. Josh had been dragged off by long arms reaching through the haze, attached to a body that Scott couldn't see. He tried to chase it down, firing shot after shot at where he thought the beast to be. A half block down the street, all he had found was Josh's camcorder and a part of his jaw. He made it the rest of the way back on his own. When he reached the hunting shack, he took a moment to remove his keys from Mark's corpse, smash the in-car police computers, shred apart their notebooks, and stomp their radios before entering the hunting shack. Looking around for the second time that day, he unfolded the family portrait tucked into his breast pocket. On the back were a few words. "Found it in the mines, hid it beneath the floorboards. I know they're working for devils, but they won't scare me." Under the writing was another drawing of that sign of Brimstone. Scott kicked over the deerskin rug, revealing a few loose boards, one marked with the symbol. Scott lifted the wood, his face shifting from fatigue and rage into a smile. "So, that's where you put it," he said to himself. Then he tucked the skull under his arm, mindful of the horns. Yeah, every group of friends has that one asshole, right? Some of them, well, they're just a lot worse. So stay scary, my wildlings. Maybe next time you hear about a trip to a town with a hellmouth, maybe give it a pass. They tend not to work out well. And make the most of your nights.